start by saying thank you so much to the amazing teams at Protocol Labs, at Agoric, and at The Interval who have put this event together. This space is amazing. Everything is working perfectly so far. Just wait, I'm going to start talking. But for a brief moment, this night was going really well, so thank you all. All right, so I love building software. One of the things that I love the most about building software is that it's this magic flavor of tool where when you learn to use the tool, you also learn how to improve the tool for free, right? So when you start writing software, you can write more software and you can use it to make tools that make it even easier to write even better software. So to frame this a little bit, right? Imagine that it's 1950 and you are one of the very early software developers and you are writing programs and they're really useful and you're doing lots of cool stuff with them, but you're writing them in assembly. And you're not having a good time because handwriting programs in assembly is really obnoxious and really hard and takes a long time. So what do? You decide that you can use the skill you already have, which is writing assembly, and you use it to create a tool that permanently makes yours and everyone else's life easier, right? You don't have to go ask an expert how to make that tool. You just use the skill you already have, which is writing assembly, and you create Fortran. And now you have a real a programming language that's easier to write and easier to reason about. And this process repeats a few more times, and we end up with Rust, and we're done. So, great work. Good job. This is not true in every industry, right? So if you're a carpenter, for example, and you have a hammer or a saw that doesn't work the way you want it to, you can't just use your carpentry skills to build a better hammer. You have to go learn orthogonal skills. You have to become a blacksmith or something else, right? You can't scratch your own itch. So I believe that this virtuous cycle where you can improve the tools that you're using yourself is one of the biggest reasons that software has changed the world so much in such a short time. No one is as motivated to improve something as the person who feels the pain of using it. So we're here, just in San Francisco, there's tens of thousands of people like us doing this exact thing, right? We're building and improving tools based on software. And it's pretty amazing. But whether we think about it or not, almost all of us are depending implicitly on this other tool that doesn't have these great traits. We can't improve it ourselves. We cannot make it work exactly the way that we want. Actually, the only way to interact with it reliably is to hire expensive experts and communicate with them and pay them lots of money. And if we use it wrong, this tool has the potential to break everything in ways that we might not detect for many, many years. And that tool is called, this legal construct that we call a corporation. So the tech industry is largely organized around corporations, right? We're working on this, but its reality today is that the majority of us either work or have worked for these corporations. And I think probably most people in this room have at least dreamed about building a successful company, right? And lots of you have done it. If you're like me, when you're thinking about building a company, you're thinking about the fun stuff. You're thinking about working on a great idea, building a great team, maybe like getting lots of investor money. That's pretty fun too, right? Or it can be. It's actually less fun than it sounds. The idea of like the company itself is this legal construct off to the side. It sort of feels like it's just this static part of the world, right? It's like you have this idea and you're building a company, and you go and talk to some lawyers and they hand you a huge stack of papers, and you just kind of sign them, and then you have this thing that exists, right? So you want to do this, you want to be building this company and working on cool tech, and then you sign this stack of documents, and like you graft this thing onto your company, right? And it's not really the thing that you were trying to do. And it also has this side effect where now forever, you have this like little fear in the back of your brain that this guy is going to come into your office and say, hey, really sorry, but like we forgot an Oxford comma, and Ben Horowitz owns the rights to your kidney. But like it's fine, it's market, it's totally normal. So, the corporate form that we've grafted onto our idea is not a static part of the universe. This is a thing that like we can build, we can improve, people do it all the time, right? We can adapt this tool and take advantage of all the powerful things that it lets us do, right? It lets you control, or lets you decide like who controls an idea, who owns it, who has the right to make decisions about it. So what I want to talk about today is how to take corporations and make them our tool. So to add attributes to existing legal corporations the way they work today, to make it easier for software engineers to directly interact with them, to make our own companies more computable and hackable, and to give us the ability to make our own tools better directly. So if we want to improve our tools, whenever you want to start improving something, you have to understand how it works in great detail, right? That's the first step. The good news is that before I started building software, I had a very unstoried career as a corporate lawyer. So I hit a little corporate law TED Talk inside the smart contracts event. So like if you need to refill your drink, get it, totally fair. But a little background helps us get to the fun stuff more easily. So just zooming out for folks who haven't maybe gone through this process, what does a corporation look like sort of structurally, and then how do we get there legally? So structurally, you have a layer at the top, which is a bunch of people in companies called stockholders. They own the economic rights to the company. If the company is sold, these are the people who get money. And they also get to vote on a certain set of things for the corporation. Among those things, they get to appoint a group coming down the funnel called the board of directors. The board of directors is a small group of people. They control a few sets of high-level decisions about the company. Most classically, they have the ability to hire and fire a CEO. Coming down the funnel, you have the CEO. The CEO builds out an executive team, hires other employees, and actually does the day-to-day work of running the company. That's the structure. This structure gets created by something. It's not just this like magic thing that comes out of the ground. It sort of is though, because lawyers are weird. So how does it get created? Like there is some magic legal incantation or series of incantations that happens that creates this thing. What are those? I should flag that we're talking about American company, like the flavor of company that gets formed in Silicon Valley traditionally. There's lots of other stuff that can happen in the world. We're talking about that little narrow set. So you start with this thing in the middle that's called a certificate of incorporation. And the certificate of incorporation is a filing that you make with the Secretary of State somewhere, and it includes a bunch of descriptions of the rules that govern your corporation. These are things like how many shares the company gets to issue, who gets to decide, who gets paid when the company's sold, who gets to appoint the board of directors, lots of other things like that. You have a bunch of other documents that are not things that you file with the state that basically graft more and more Byzantine sets of rules on top of the certificate of incorporation. So you're still dealing with the same general flavor of things. You're still dealing with issues of control and economics and voting and all that stuff. But these are private contracts. You can structure them to be arbitrarily complex, but they work in the same universe. And then finally, you have another set of documents, which if the two sets that we've talked about so far are about setting up the structure and the rules of the corporation, these are the documents that update the state of the corporation. So once you have these rules in place, you might want to like actually sell stock to a specific individual person or company. So you're going to have a thing called a stock purchase agreement, and you execute it, and then the state of the company changes, right? Like the stock ownership is now something different from what it was before because you've executed these rules. And that's pretty much it, actually. Like, you know, this ends up with a stack of documents this thick, but it's not really that crazy. You sign all these documents. You stick them in a filing cabinet, and then later, if you want to make changes to the company, if you want to either change these rules or do things like sell stock or anything like that, you just use the same general chunk of documents and you file them away, and like life goes on. So this is how a lawyer thinks about creating and updating and maintaining a company. So as a recovering lawyer, I will take off my suit and like put my hoodie back on and explain as a software engineer why like this model for keeping track of what's going on with companies is just like absolutely insane. Like it's totally insane. Why is it insane? There are two reasons. So when you have a contract, there are lots and lots of types of rules and information that are not natural to represent with written English language. So for example, you might have a paragraph that looks like this. If you work for a venture-backed company, you do have a paragraph that looks like this. And this is slimmed down. This describes a really simple concept, which is that if you invest money in the company, then when people take money out of the company, you get your money back first. It gets represented as plain English language. The point I'm making here is not really like, let's try to make lawyers do math. I gave up on that one a long time ago. But it illustrates this deeper structural problem that repeats over and over through the way that we create companies, right? So that same concept, really satisfyingly represented in a totally abstract way by like 20 lines of code. Because this is fundamentally a math problem. The implementation here is not that important, but it's really easy to create a data structure, pipe some stock ownership through this function, and just solve this problem forever. But we don't do that because we have this one-size-fits-all tool, which is English language written in contracts. That's what we use to do everything in our companies today. That's sort of silly, right? Because we have this thing that's a corporation, and actually at the core of this is a pretty tight set of legal truths, right? We have these rules that we've talked about, like who gets paid when the company's sold. We have truths about state, like who owns stock. We try to represent it instead as this massive chunk of English language. We make updates with even more English language, and then we just sort of like hope no one loses the keys to the filing cabinet. And it goes fine. All the time it goes fine. The big problem with this is that English is a pretty bad encoding format, especially if you're looking for deterministic outputs. Every contract has ambiguity in it. Disputes come up all the time. English is definitely not computer readable or writable today, the way it's using contracts. There are people working on tools to parse this, but it looks like it's probably like an artificial general intelligence problem to actually extract structured data from these contracts, right? So this sucks, right? There's no way to extract data from these documents without paying a really expensive, really highly trained human to go through them line by line. And, just in case that doesn't sound bad already, that's not guaranteed to produce correct information, which brings me to my second quarrel with existing corporations. This one is the really scary one to me. So everything that we just talked about, this whole process, forming the corporation, selling stock, voting on stuff, it is probabilistic under real world conditions. What do I mean by that? It's not guaranteed that it worked, and it's not guaranteed in ways that you might not detect right away, and you might not find out until much later that something's broken. The basic reason for this is because there are technical legal requirements for an agreement to be effective, right? So imagine that, for example, you're trying to sell some stock to an investor, and you draft up a bunch of contracts, you work with your lawyers, you think everything's being done correctly, your lawyers think everything's being done correctly, your investors think everything's being done correctly, you all sign on the dotted line, they wire you money, you send them stock certificates, the company keeps operating. Much, much later, years later, you find out that there was some arcane vote that needed to be done for this transaction to be effective, and you didn't do it. So now you have a mismatch between legal state and the state of the world. And there are ways to solve this mismatch, but they are expensive, they're uncertain, and they all shoot you off into this realm of undefined behavior. And like the solution to this is, of course, more lawyers. So the incentives to fix this problem are like not overwhelmingly strong sometimes. So those are the two big problems. Now that everyone feels really uncomfortable about the state of the world, let's talk a little bit about how to fix it. So tons and tons of really smart people like Dean, who we'll talk next, are working to create what I think of as actual proper smart contracts, right? Electronic bundles of rights that allow contractual relationships to be enforced through programs. I think that those efforts are going to be amazingly successful and have been already in a lot of ways, but I am pretty impatient and I'm pretty excited to get going now. So I think we can strictly improve the way that corporations work today without having to build any new technology, or very, very little new technology. And I'm really excited about that. So I want to start bridging that gap towards the future that Agoric and other people are building and sort of start coming at them from the other shore, right? That means figuring out a way to make corporations more computable in a way that's backwards compatible with the existing legal system. So put it a different way, I want to upgrade dumb contracts and make them a little smarter, a little more computable, and a little bit more accessible, and then keep building layers on top of that. So how do we do that? A somewhat less insane way, no one ever says that at a smart contract event. They're like, I have an idea that's really normal and like totally makes sense. So I have an idea that's normal and totally makes sense. That's not true. We'll see. A less insane way to think about those documents that we talked about earlier is that they create this like tiny little program, right? So the certificate of incorporation and those stockholder agreements create a set of rules. And then you think of those rules as transition functions, right? And then the stock purchase agreement, the voting documents and things like that create updates to state. And we can model this company's activities over time as a representation of just these rules, these transition functions, and the resulting state. And this is pretty cool. We can check these rules to make sure they're valid. We now have the entire lifespan of this company's governance represented as clean data and a verifiable record of all of the state transitions that have happened over time. We have to solve two pretty difficult problems to do this in a way that people can actually practically use. First, how do you build this program to handle all of the insane complexity that comes up in actual corporate governance structures without making the program too complex to build reliably or too expensive to build practically? And then second, how do we make the program reliable? And I'm talking about a specific flavor of reliability here, which means that how do we increase the likelihood that the existing legal system will agree that the state of our program represents a legal truth correctly? So to start, keeping complexity and cost down. Zooming back out of the software world into the legal world for 1 second, there's this concept in legal theory of complete and incomplete contracts. A complete contract is one that tries to predict and define outcomes for every possible future state of the world. An incomplete contract is one that defines the most important parts of the contracts, the things that the parties are most likely to care about, and then drops the rest of the contract back to this backdrop, which you can think of as the common law or statute. And what these are default rules, right? So you don't have to specify the behavior of your contract completely. You can just specify the parts that are important to you, and then you can trust that there's this reasonable set of default rules in the background that will like make something not too crazy happen if there's something you forgot about. And this works pretty well, and this is a desirable trait for contracts to have. It turns out that in the real world today, people don't really use complete contracts for anything complex. They're very expensive to make, and it actually turns out that we're not particularly good at predicting exactly what we'll want in far future dates. So it's really hard to write an incomplete smart contract though, right? Because when you're trying to define everything through program execution, you don't have cheap, straightforward access to this backdrop that just happens for free when you write a normal contract. So the nice thing is that since under this framework, we're starting by using the existing legal system as a base layer instead of defaulting to pure program execution, we can cheat, which I love to do, and turn this hard problem into two easier problems. You can break down the rules that define a corporation into two chunks, okay? So there are things that happen in corporate governance that I think of as objective or completely computable. And these are things like updates to stock ownership. These are things like votes. And then there's things that require subjective real-world data. Like, for example, a common thing that you'll see in governance documents is that the CEO has to ask the board's permission before selling all the company's assets. So it's pretty hard for a program to know whether the CEO has sold all the company's assets. Like, that sort of happens out in the real world. So a program is not a great tool for tracking that state or making decisions based on it today. But the program is a really good tool for tracking things that are totally objective and totally deterministic, like stock ownership, like voting, things like that. And there are lots of rules that follow along these same lines. So what we do is we break the program into, or we break the company, the program, that's great. We break the company into two parts. The parts that are objectively representable and the parts that are subjective. And then we define a program to handle the objectively representable parts, and we just punt the rest of the existing legal system. And this is cool because it creates the potential for this to be a pure upgrade. So you don't have to make a bunch of hard value trade-offs between like whether you want the rigor of a smart contract or the flexibility of a traditional contract. You can just use the right tool for the right job at a pretty granular level. All right, so we solved the complexity and cost trade-off. That's great, great work. We still have to deal with this problem of reliability. So we've written this program. It updates corporate state. We think that we've done a really good job of defining which pieces should fall under this program. But then like someone out in meat space argues, despite the fact that our program is amazing and perfect, they argue that it's wrong and they win. They win because courts. And we're mad. But actually what turns out is that our program is wrong, which really hurts as a software developer, right? But like what matters in this program is that the program state is an accurate representation of legal state. So if legal state is something other than what my program says, even though the math was right, the program is still wrong, and that sucks, and it makes me mad. So we need to figure out a way to couple these two states together pretty tightly. If that's too abstract, here's an example. So remember around the time of the Facebook IPO when Eduardo Saverin sued and claimed that he owned Facebook stock? I have no opinion on like the facts of that, right? But what that claim is fundamentally is Eduardo Saverin is saying, the state that you've maintained at your company, this state that represents who owns stock is wrong. And I have an argument that a different state is correct, and I will present it. And Facebook, of course, has relied on this system that we've already talked about, which is chaining together a bunch of English language documents, and real-world facts come in and make things even more ambiguous. And this gross thing happens where this attempt to get to the truth decomposes into an expected value problem, where it's impossible to sift through the real-world facts in a practical way. There's lots of outside pressures. And you end up with this thing called a settlement, which is this like thing that I find incredibly gross, which is like, okay, we're just gonna do this thing that is clearly not the correct state. We're just gonna like split the middle or split the difference and do a settlement and give you some stock and just like make this problem go away. I don't like that that's like a common outcome, but it's because determining state in a real world corporation is very, very expensive. So I sort of think that we've already made this problem better just by rigorously defining these transition functions and defining state as a data structure. But we actually can't completely eliminate this type of uncertainty by just deferring to program execution. I don't think that this concept of code is law is quite there. Like, I don't think it'll necessarily ever be there. You're always going to need some way to account for errors that happen in contract drafting, whether programmatic or real. And you want to clean that stuff up in a way that doesn't fall into the realm of undefined behavior and just asking a judge to figure it out again, right? So we want something that's just a little bit less than a perfect alignment between program state and legal state. But we still want our program to have pretty good finality. And so since we have the legal system as a backdrop, we can potentially use a legally grounded solution to solve this problem. So there's this concept in law of an evidentiary standard, or you might have heard it referred to as a burden of proof. A burden of proof, when we think about things being wrong or right, we think about them as binaries, but it turns out that in legal disputes, usually there is some amount of correctness on both sides, right? And so an evidentiary standard asks the question, if you're trying to convince a judge that you are right in some sort of dispute, like how much do you have to convince her, right? Is it like just a little bit? Is it a majority? Is it like way beyond? It turns out in contract disputes, there's actually, like, which is rare in law, there's a defined answer to this question. The standard is something called a preponderance of the evidence, which means 51%. So if you can convince the judge that you are 51% right, then you win the case. For example, in criminal law, we have different standards. So we have a standard called beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal law. And that's the reason we have that is a value judgment, right? We have decided that this thing that we're interfering with, which is someone's freedom, is very, very important. And interfering with it should therefore require a very high standard from us before we're willing to overturn this background presumption, right? So we have this program, and we have rigorously defined the things that this program is very, very good at and very, very reliable at. We're pretty confident that it's correct. We want to make this program line up with legal truth in a way that a judge will actually enforce. So the question is, can we create a contractual evidentiary standard that increases the threshold to which someone has to present evidence to overturn the state of this contract, right? Not to 100%, because then you have code as law and it's brittle, but to something higher. It turns out that legally, this is my favorite legal answer, the answer is probably weird, but okay. So this has been largely an academic question, but there have been some articles in really good law journals and other places that basically say, yeah, we think this works. So you can take a contractual provision that says, notwithstanding the fact that the background assumption here is that you can win with just a bare majority of evidence, we're going to decide amongst us that we're cranking that standard up. And you end up with legal language that you could slot into an existing legal agreement that looks something like this, right? So you carve out this chunk of things that you think you can represent really well, you point them to a program, and then you just create the single sentence, right? To dispute the validity of that program's outputs, a party must provide clear and convincing evidence that the outputs of that program differ from the intent of the parties. And this gets us to a pretty good place. Clear and convincing is another legally accepted standard. It means like very high. It's like 90% maybe. It's sort of squishy. But what we've done is that we have coupled our program tightly, but not quite perfectly, to legal truth. So we still have an escape hatch if something goes really wrong, but we can rely on the outputs of the program. That's kind of a lot. So quick recap. Here's what we've done. We have separated out the rules that govern our program into two buckets, things that require subjective information from the real world and things that we can objectively determine. We write a program to handle all of the objective things like economics and stock ownership and voting. We are really confident that our program is going to handle these objective things correctly, so we apply a higher standard to anyone who tries to come forward and claim that they are wrong. And then for all of the other really difficult problems on the computer side, we just punt them to the existing system, and they're at least not worse than they are today. Useful to take a second to define what we get here and what we don't, because this is a little bit a field of what smart contract events normally discuss. One thing that we get that's great is that this giant chunk of our company is now computer legible. A computer can interact with this stuff directly. You can ask your company questions programmatically about how to do certain things, and it can talk to you, right? This is really cool. You can query it about who owns stock, and it can tell you. More on that in a second. What we don't get here are the things that people who work on blockchains and smart contracts think about a lot, which are things like trustless execution and a really strongly verifiable audit trail and things like that. I believe those concepts are completely complementary with the approach that we've talked about here, but it's not what this approach brings. So I don't mean to imply that it does anything magical in those areas. It definitely doesn't. So I do like talking about software a lot, but sometimes it's fun to use software instead. So let's take a look at what the near future could look like if we decide to actually build this software to improve this tool. Full disclosure, these are almost exclusively mocks. Like most of this is pretty straightforward to implement, but I haven't. So I don't mean to be misleading. So I would like to form a company, like right now. So I have to go down the street to like Fenwick or wherever, like a big law firm, and find a lawyer and pay them like $5,000 to $20,000 and sign a bunch of papers. Or having built out this useful infrastructure, I can, who's used like React, like create React app or something like that, right? To just like build out a scaffold from a template. So I've done this before. So I have a starter company. The owner is me. So I pull down the fresh template. Oh, done. Cool. So it's not quite that easy. That would be really irresponsible. We need to have a prompt that makes me say Y or N. It's just really rigorous software engineering practice. So I will form it. I will file my certificate. And now I have a company, and it's stored locally. So I think that's fun. Like, I like the idea that that could work. And like this clearly works today. Like, there's no reason that we can't do this. You can derive all of the documents and stuff that investors and law firms want to see from this thing that you've just done. It's no problem. It's a templating engine, right? It's pretty cool. So we have a company. What's the saying? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, bring a friend, right? So we have to bring in friends to our company. So what does that mean in corporate law speak? We have to issue them stock. So we could like make a ream of documents, then stock purchase agreements or whatever. Or we could define a data structure where we talk about the people that we want to add to the company, right? So these are my esteemed co-founders. They've been involuntarily recruited. They're here in the crowd. Welcome. So we've just done this. So what I want to do is issue some stock to these people. And I will just take that file in. And I have now done this. And so now the fun thing is that I can see what my company looks like. So it goes from this company that I own individually to this company that's just brought in all these people, right? And we can look at that. So we're worried about wanting, like, one thing that I really think this helps is it improves testability. So right now I have to go to a lawyer and be like, what documents do I have to sign to do this? Did it work? And they'll be like, I don't know, probably. So the fun thing about this is that, so we've now, like, think of this as like having loaded these changes to my company into my staging environment, right? Since my program knows the rules about how to make these changes, it's just testable. So because it's a single person company that I own and control today, it's obvious that like this should work trivially, and in fact it does. So I check the permissions, and being happy with the state of the world after this, I execute. And of course I have a confirmation problem, I'm not crazy. And that's done, the stock's issued, right? It's pretty fun. I like this vision of the world. Let's get weirder. Let's crank it up. So, all right. So, say that the company is doing really, really well, and someone wants to invest, right? This is good times. So they send over a ream of documents that I have to look through, right? No, not anymore. Not today. They send over a clean data structure, okay? So they send over this document, and it has the state of my company before and after the investment round, right? That's all I care about. What I care about is this transition, okay? I want to analyze this. So I want to analyze it. I don't really have good context, so I'm going to go to a law firm and ask them if it's fair and how it works. No. What we're going to do is just, so because we have these big chunks of the company represented as clean data, this is really cool. So now, what we can do is unionize with all of our other fellow co-founders. We can collude to bring this data together, and then we can make informed comparisons about like the offers we've gotten and the offers other people have gotten without having to bring in experts. We can sort of like crowdsource this knowledge, right? So ideally, to me, the way that this works is that we have a tool to compare these things. So we have this file that our investor has just sent over. We want to compare it to some known file, right? So maybe like Y Combinator stores like median Series A terms, right, or something like that. And they just make it publicly available. So I run this comparison, pulls down the latest stats, and then you can just stack these things side by side, right? You can just say like, okay, this is pretty fair, this is a little bit higher, but I'm comfortable with it. You can just make reasoned decisions about this. So you've done this, so you're happy with the terms. You want to see what the company ownership looks like. So we know how to do that already as well. So it's added because we've loaded this term sheet into our staging corporation, right? So we looked at this stuff. We feel good about the state of the world, and we decide that we want to execute, right? So we decide we want to do this thing. So we brought our friends, though. So now when I try to run these stage changes, because the ownership of the company is not just me, there's other stakeholders involved, I know that I need other people to chime in before I can do this. So I run this test. This is not a problem, it's just a feature. It's something we have to do to make this agreement legally effective, right? So I'm happy with this. So I run my execute command. I hit Y because I'm responsible. And now I'm requesting a signature. This is sped up. And then once my co-founder signs off on this, right, then the agreement is effective. It's done. There's one more thing that you can do that's sort of fun, which is today when you sell a company, you have to like hire an investment banker, and they build this like massive spreadsheet of all the different, like they go through these massive paragraphs that represent pretty simple rules. They build out like the liquidation waterfall and do all this stuff. They charge you like $1 million for it. It's a pretty easy math problem, and we've taken pains to keep it a pretty easy math problem, right? So you can do fun stuff like just calculating how much money everyone gets when the company's sold, which is really, really easy if you just line things up correctly, right? So you just run it in there and it's done. And it works pretty nicely, right? We haven't solved all the problems. There's still a bunch of thorny stuff that you kick out to lawyers, you kick out to all that stuff. But we have improved our ability to interact with these things directly, which I think is very, very cool. Wait. So those are examples of problems that exist today. And I actually do think that it's amazing just to solve those problems. But the more important thing to me is to circle back to the original topic of the talk, right? Which is that upgrading companies, in addition to solving all these efficiency issues and things like that, brings us a step closer to reclaiming this tool that we use and depend on for ourselves. And once hackers and people who build things are able to directly work on and improve those things, like all around us there's evidence of what a powerful effect that has. So to end on a hopeful note, if corporations today are written in assembly, what's Rust going to look like? Yep. All right. Yeah?
When can we use this?
I think you can probably do the implementation side of this in like 6 months of focused work. That's my guess. Yeah.
How do you tell the subjective and objective apart?
You know, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, how do you tell the subjective and objective parts of contracts apart?
I think in the early days, for sure, you have to have lawyers pretty heavily involved in this just to think through it. But the way that I differentiate it to myself is that updates that give you all the information you need to determine future updates are the ones that are objective. So for example, when you, like the example that I fall back to because it's the easiest one is like if you have rules about which stockholders need to vote to do certain things like issue more stock, then you know the state of your stockholder list before and after any transition, and you know you can define the rule correctly. So it's pretty straightforward to represent that internally. The reason that this takes like 6 months and not 6 hours to implement is because I suspect that there are a lot of edge cases that you have to think through pretty rigorously. The nice thing is that you can break off only the chunks that are absolutely the most clear to start with. So you can only take the things that you're totally sure work as internal representations and then push the boundaries on that later in ways that are less likely to break things than trying to solve it all up front. Yeah.
So would you have to get a Secretary of State to agree that that's a contract?
I don't think so. Without getting too far into the weeds, there is a pretty strong presumption of respecting the preferences of parties as stated in contracts. There's also helpful enabling legislation in Delaware that says, for example, that you can maintain corporate records on a blockchain. I think that that was true anyway. Like you can maintain them on a napkin if you want to, and it works. Yeah. But having that there is helpful in terms of getting people comfortable using this. And I do think that the question of legal effectiveness is an important one, but the question of like how to get people to use this thing is also an important one. So you want to have some things to stack to make people feel like the answer to your question is yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Will investors vote for it? I mean, I guess, you know, so lawyers won't.
Mm-hmm.
It's clearly in companies' interests.
Mm-hmm.
So who has to vote for it to make it work? Are investors? I mean, in this example, your VCs.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So who votes for it? You know,
Oh yeah, sure. So the question basically is who votes for this idea to be adopted? Who's the one who has to drive the use of this thing? So your claim was that investors have to be the ones driving this. There's a background assumption there that I'm not sure I completely agree with, although it's true sometimes, which is that investors have all the power in this relationship. Especially in Silicon Valley, I think the best companies can have a lot of leverage as well. I think probably the very best people to introduce something like this would be a company like Y Combinator or another accelerator. and just mandate that the portfolio companies use this system. Yeah, one.
I'd probably add that investors absolutely want this, because think of like the legal nightmare that is for investors in portfolios of very large companies to go and check that all of this is correct and that something hasn't gone horribly awry, or that if a company is going to get sold, that in that process that can be a very fast diligence. Investors tend to ultimately pay for this in company assets in like the tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, over the lifetime of a company. And so absolutely investors on the company, they're all aligned with this.
Yeah.
So what kind of companies do you think are going to try this first?
It's got to be software companies. The appeal to software companies is just so obvious to me. At least to me, it's obvious. I want this to exist today. That's my guess.
So certainly the filing cabinet's not the only place. People have got to have spreadsheets and databases and stuff where they keep this.
But here's the thing.
Repeat the question.
Oh, so
Repeat it.
Yeah.
Yes, and surely the filing cabinet's not the only place where people keep this data. Surely they keep it in spreadsheets and databases and stuff.
it would be so much. I would feel so much better about the world if that were true. Here's the thing. So people absolutely generate spreadsheets and they have big lists of who owns stock and all those things. It doesn't matter what the spreadsheet says. That's the absolutely insane thing about all this. What you have, whether you like it or not, is this chain of functions that's been created by plain language legal documents. They either work or they didn't.
So they never refer to the spreadsheet from the document.
It doesn't matter if you refer to the spreadsheet in some ways. You can represent, so I as the company, this is what happens in practice. I as the company make that spreadsheet, I send it to you. I promise you that the spreadsheet is correct. If the spreadsheet's not correct, then I have to pay for it. It doesn't mean that the spreadsheet's correct. It just means that we've allocated a risk between the two of us as to who's responsible if it's wrong. That is much worse than having the spreadsheet be an actual tie to the legal state of the company, which is what I'm trying to do here. I know it's unsettling. Yeah.
I just trying to, I can't tell the difference. What's the difference between a spreadsheet macro and what you showed us?
It's a good question. What's up? Yeah.
Can you fast forward to when marriage licenses, birth certificates, and everything else is done this way? Like, where do you see a limit?
I don't have any particular expertise over those things, other than that they seem like sort of straightforward record-keeping problems, and I suspect that the issue there is more getting folks to adopt it and agree on standards and all the normal yeoman's work of getting that stuff adopted. Yeah. One more?
So I assume lawyers will hate this because their business is based on it. Can you put your lawyer hat back on and play devil's advocate and say, from a lawyer's perspective, why this will not work?
So I was a unique lawyer, mostly unique because my career as a lawyer was so short. I would have been a lawyer longer if this existed. Like the stuff that we're automating here is not the interesting work that you like go to a good law school to do. The stuff that we're doing here is just grunt work, like running through Excel spreadsheets, trying to make things work, parsing like contract language that's similar but slightly different than 50 other things you've seen. So if I had been able to abstract this stuff away to program execution and work on the actual interesting problems that require human interaction, I would have been a lawyer for longer and I would have liked it more. I don't think that's true for everyone. I think there's lots of people who like love, especially having other people do that boring work and billing a lot for it. But I think that there's a lot of people who would actually get behind this in a pretty good way. Thank you all.